There's not a guarantee that if you increase your force production by X number of newtons, you're going to see a translation to X number of kilograms on the bar. You've just raised your potential to do that, but there are other factors at play that we have to take into consideration.
Hi, Shaun. It's my pleasure to have you on the Evidence Strong show for the second time. Please briefly introduce yourself.
Hi, Alex. Thanks again for having me on to Evidence Strong. I'm really pleased to be here for a second time. So my name is Shaun Joffe. I'm a senior lecturer in strength and conditioning at St Mary's University. Prior to this role, I worked with British Weightlifting with their performance program as a strength and conditioning / performance scientist, which hopefully we'll get into in a bit more detail, because much of that kind of has fed into a lot of the research that we'll be discussing today.
Awesome. So in the previous interview, we discussed 3 studies that had to do with finding the correlations between the tests that are used and the performance in Olympic weightlifting. So let's recap these shortly so we can move to the next topic that is related to it. So how we can use these to predict performance.
Yeah, so broadly speaking, the majority of that research was predominantly cross-sectional, with the exception of a minor component in the first study. But I guess for the majority of what those first 3 papers showed was that both jump, isometric, and dynamic strength measures, such as 1 rep max performances in front and back squat, they all tend to show very large correlations with performance. So they all have arguably some utility in predicting performance to some degree. When you interrogate the data a little bit more, you start to see that there are perhaps a few distinctions between some of the metrics. So for example, in the first study, we did a cross-sectional and longitudinal design, and it was the isometric tests that predicted cross-sectionally and longitudinally, whereas jump test measures only predicted cross-sectionally but didn't predict longitudinally.
Sorry, Shaun, could you explain what cross-sectional means and what longitudinal means in the context of research in weightlifting?
Yeah, so cross-sectional, we essentially was one data point and one point in time. So we test a series of athletes at a particular time, and then we just ran some cross-sectional correlational analyses. So we're just looking at relationships or associations between 2 measures. It tells you about the magnitude or the strength of the relationship that exists between the 2, and that perhaps is your first point in trying to infer whether there may be some longitudinal association between the 2. So you might see if there's a relationship between, say, isometric mid-thigh pull peak force and clean and jerk performance, that you would suspect that if you improve your mid-thigh pull peak force, that would translate into a better clean and jerk. Now, we have to be cautious with interpreting cross-sectional data because we can't infer causality from cross-sectional, so we need something more longitudinal. In the best case scenario, you'd have randomized control designs. Hard to apply blinding in a real applied context like this, but there would be a much more degree of control over an extended period of time where you expose an athlete to a specific training intervention, a series of athletes to a training intervention, and then you evaluate the effects of that training intervention. And then you can be more certain about whether certain types of training induce certain physiological changes and neuromuscular changes, and then whether that then translated into performance. And that's really where you want to try and get to, but it's inherently very difficult to do that in applied environments where you have high-level weightlifters who aren't necessarily accessible all the time for that sort of controlled research. So that kind of moves into the longitudinal design. So I didn't have the second part of that study was we didn't have much control over the athletes' training. That was largely dictated by them and their coaches. But what we could do was evaluate their neuromuscular characteristics through the series of tests that we used, and then look at their competition performance. And we looked at simply a change over a 1-year period. So which neuromuscular measures changed, which competition performance measures changed, and then we correlated that data. So we can start to infer a little bit more causality. We still have to be really cautious because we still don't have like the methodological control to be certain, but it allows us to show that, okay, well, counter movement jump and isometric mid-thigh pull strongly correlated with performance. But when you look at their change over a 1-year period, only one of those measures showed a significant improvement. And if you look at the relationship between the changes and the changes in performance, only the isometric test data showed an association with performance long term. So that leads us to suspect initially that maximal strength is more of a determinant of performance improvement over time, whereas the jump data seems to be more of a strong cross-sectional predictor of performance, but doesn't seem to be something that changes much long term. We could perhaps delve into a lot more depth as to what that is. Perhaps it's worth people going back and looking at the first interview we did, which we sort of dissected that study in a bit more detail. But hopefully we'll get onto one of the recent studies that's just been accepted, where we start to look at some of the more longitudinal analyses. But kind of coming back to those first three that we discussed in the last interview, the second paper compared different isometric pull positions, so the mid-thigh versus the start position, and that found that for the most part, the start position, when we measured peak force, showed significantly greater correlations of snatch and total performance. Clean and jerk just missed out by a very small margin, so didn't quite meet the statistical significance, but certainly indicative that the start position was a better correlate and predictor of performance. And then the meta-analyses, where we just summarized all of the assessment tools and metrics derived from those tests. At that time, a lot more work has been published since then, but at the time it was showing that, again, predominantly measures of maximal strength, either through front and back squat 1 rep max or isometric mid-thigh pull, seem to be the better predictors of performance. In terms of the time dependent measures, so things like rate of force development and force at specific time intervals, that seem to show that the more time available you have to produce force, those measures seem to increase in terms of their correlation to performance. So for example, force at 100 milliseconds had a poorer or smaller correlation with performance measures compared with force at 200 milliseconds. And then you get to peak force, where you're not constrained by time at all, and that showed the greatest correlation with performance. So it seems like, again, it indicates, or certainly suggests to me, that maximal strength rather than time dependent strength or ballistic force production seems to be the stronger correlations of performance. But when you take a previous study as well, which wasn't included in that meta-analysis in terms of the isometric start position, the study was included. There weren't enough studies at the time on the start position to include it, but it seems that its maximal strength was driving performance. But not only that, it's also specifically your maximal force near the start of the movement. And there's been quite a few studies that have been done since then that have actually corroborated the findings. So it's been done, I think, in male and female, national, international, and I think now youth and senior level lifters, and all broadly showing similar findings, that the start position shows a better predicted performance than the mid-thigh. So that kind of brings us up to this point. So that's largely what we discussed last time. And I guess that perhaps brings us on to the next few studies. One that was recently published, I think last year, in Sports Biomechanics, and another that's just been accepted. And hopefully we can delve into those.
Would you be able to summarize what is the difference in trying to predict or correlate other measures to performance in snatch versus clean and jerk?
So for the most part, if you take the findings from the meta-analysis, all of the forest plots, or the final output of the forest plots, because we included, I think, about 30 separate meta-analyses within that. So we created a separate summarizing figure that illustrates all the different metrics organized according to their correlation magnitude, and there's one for snatch and one for clean and jerk. And for the most part, it looks as though snatch and clean and jerk broadly have similar correlates or predictors. So where isometric mid-thigh pull is ranked on that figure, it's almost the same for both. So it doesn't seem to be much of a difference between snatch and clean and jerk. Now, I think there probably is scope to explore where there may be differences in predictors, because that, for me, I think there almost certainly will be. But based on the data so far, I would say there probably isn't enough to suggest that we have certain metrics that are better predictors of snatch and some that are better predictors of clean and jerk. I am aware of some more recent research that has applied a different modeling technique that has shown certain measures predict snatch better and certain measures predict clean and jerk better. But yeah, I couldn't necessarily talk you through the details of those studies. But so far from what I've observed, we haven't necessarily sought out to differentiate the predictors of snatch and clean and jerk. And just looking at the available data, there's nothing that really jumps out that suggests at this stage that there are things that differentiate in terms of predictors between snatch and clean and jerk.
In the newest study, you were comparing maximal isometric force in first pull, transition, and second pull in clean. Could you walk me through the setup of the study?
So this study, the data that was included in this analysis was part of the same original data set was collected whilst I was working with British Weightlifting. So it was the same broad data set fed into the first few studies. Now, we expanded the entry criteria to include some of the national level lifters just in order to have a fuller data set, in order to be able to have perhaps a bit more statistical power to answer this question. It's always quite difficult when you're using sort of retrospective data to answer the question, because when it comes to things like statistical power, you're constrained with what data you collected at the time and who you had available. So it's not necessarily like a prospective study where you're recruiting. So we're always somewhat constrained by those parameters. But nevertheless, we had enough information to be able to really have a good go at answering this particular question. And the main thing we were trying to distinguish here was there's 3 isometric pull positions that were part of our test protocol at the time, and they were the start position, the start of the transition position, so bar approximately at knee height, and then the mid-thigh pull position. So we've kind of got positions that correspond with the start of the first pull, transition, and second pull phases, and those obviously used as the key sort of differentiators in terms of the 3 sub-phases within the pull, within the lift. So it made sense to try to replicate those particular positions and looking at what the maximal force capacities were in relation to each. Now, given that the previous work had shown that the isometric start position pull was a better predictor of weightlifting performance measures, since then there was another study that had actually included the transition position as well. That was by the author Benzeev and their colleagues, and they showed again something similar, kind of verified some of the initial findings that we had in one of our first papers. And they showed, again, a stronger correlation with the start position performance compared with the mid-thigh, but they also introduced the transition position as well. And we had that data. We had collected it previously, but it didn't really form part of the research question. But since they had published that, it kind of made us think about, okay, MEPS, there's more data to explore within the transition position and actually comparing the 3. But the next level wasn't just which is better, but do they collectively add a greater level of prediction by including them within the same model? So not just does the start position give a better prediction of performance than the mid-thigh or the transition, but collectively, do they explain a higher proportion or variance in performance? And then does that give us a stronger predictive model that we can use in terms of predicting or estimating athletes' potential performance? Now, the trouble with this study, well, not the trouble, one of the challenges initially was that you've got 3 isometric pulls, all testing largely the same muscle groups through almost not identical movement patterns, but they're all still triple extension of the hip, knee, and ankle. So inherently, you're going to expect that they're going to have a high correlation between them. So multi-collinearity. In trying to control for that, we opted for using what's referred to as a partial least squares regression. And without trying to perhaps go outside of my lane too much, the reasons for using that particular analysis technique was that it just allows you to control for that collinearity a bit more than other tests. So for example, a regression or multiple regression like we did in the first study, you have what's referred to as a variance inflation factor, and if it exceeds a certain threshold, you have to exclude certain variables. Whereas we're actually interested in, we know that there's going to be a high degree of collinearity between them. With that in mind, can we still determine whether including highly collinear variables still add additional value by including them in the same model? This particular approach allowed us to do that. It's also quite helpful for small samples, which are quite typical within performance-based data, where particularly if you're studying more elite level athletes, by the definition, elite means there's relatively few of them. So in terms of the participants included in the study, there was 31 overall, made up of about 15 males and then 16 females, so approximately a 50-50 split, and it included both our youth, junior, and our seniors at the time across national and international levels. So it was kind of any one part of the performance pathway at that stage. In terms of the data we recorded, it was the 3 isometric pull positions, so the isometric start position pull, the transition position pull, and the isometric mid-thigh pull. We only recorded isometric net peak force. So like I said, we ran a partial least squared regression analysis, allowing us to control for the collinearity between those isometric test positions. But before we got into the model, we just simply ran a one-way ANOVA just to be able to compare the 3 isometric pull positions and determine, intuitively you would expect, but is there a difference in the maximal force produced within each one of those 3 positions? And it shows quite nicely that across the 3 pull positions that there is a significant difference across each of the 3 pull positions, with a corresponding increase in force produced as you move through the pull position. So the start position is the weakest, at the knee is slightly stronger, and then the mid-thigh is the strongest position, which is probably consistent with what most people would expect. but it's nice to put some data to that to illustrate how force capacity changes across those 3 pool positions. One other thing we did was also we'd normalize the data to body mass using a allometric scale and a power exponent of 0.67. It's just to be able to try to control for any influences of body mass on the data itself. And I'll come back to that shortly, because I think it's something that is an interesting finding across all the studies about how body mass really needs to be taken into consideration when interpreting the data. But in terms of results, initially within the study, you get what's referred to as weights and loadings, and it basically just describes how much of the contribution is made from each of the 3 test positions to the model. And broadly speaking, the results showed that the tests were almost approximately equally weighted in terms of creating the model. However, you sort of run a further level of analysis referred to as a jackknife t-test, and that's really where the statistical significance is tested. But that's the level of where you determine which of those measures were significant within the model. And again, similar to previous findings, it showed that the isometric start position pool was the only significant predictor of performance, suggesting that whilst initially those other test measures contributed to the model, they didn't offer any further explanation of performance. So they weren't adding anything further to the model overall. So it really points towards that position being a better predictor of performance. And again, compared to the isometric mid-thigh pull particularly, which has probably been the more predominantly used isometric test up until this point. And in the absolute data, so before it's been scaled, it was explaining the variance in performance for snatch and clean and jerk around 80%. So 80% of the variance being explained, which again gives us a very strong predictor of performance. What's interesting, when you run the data on the allometrically scaled, and this is a pretty continuous finding right the way through the literature, it always drastically reduces the level of which, like the correlation magnitudes or the R squared or prediction. So it's kind of dropped by about 20%. So when presented using allometric scaling, it's only showing that about 61 to 63% of the variance is explained. So it's still high, but I think it illustrates a really pertinent point, that it's a bit of a digression here, but a lot of the research is done on quite heterogeneous samples, so quite spread. So it could be lightweight females all the way up to heavyweight males. And inherently, you're going to get correlations when you look at strength in relation to performance. And controlling for the influences of body mass actually shows how much of that is perhaps just body mass, the relationship or the influences that body mass have on those relationships. And perhaps a consideration for future research, we probably need to be more mindful controlling for that, either by doing more within weight category analyses of the same types of study design, but we need to perhaps think more about how we control for the influences of body mass if we were to use these types of study designs. But broadly speaking, it's consistent with the previous findings, both the work that we'd done and then some of the other literature that have looked at the start position. Everything seems to be stacking up in favor of the start position pull peak force being a better predictor of performance than isometric mid-thigh pull peak force. The added value of this particular paper is it's suggesting that the mid-thigh pull and the transition position pull don't add any further value beyond the isometric start position pull alone. You might, I guess, if you go back to some of our original rationale and others, researchers' rationale for looking at multiple isometric test positions, is that you might be able to determine whether there is a position-specific deficit, and that might then guide whether you do more training within the first pull, transition, and second pull, and try and help sort of bridge any gap.
Does it mean that if you're trying to predict performance, not if you're testing the lifter whether they are equally strong in all 3 positions, but if you're testing with the aim to prediction, you could skip the transition and mid-thigh pull? Could you only do the start position isometric pull?
Yeah, so that's what this paper is essentially suggesting, is that when it comes to predicting performance, the isometric start position pull seems to be the only measure that retains any value in the model. So it's excluded both the transition position and the mid-thigh pull position. So again, it's fairly consistent with with our previous findings and the other researchers that have shown a greater utility of that particular position, and in particular the peak force within the start position and its relationship to performance.
Do you know why I love it?
Why is that?
Because you set it up for every lifter the same.
Yeah, exactly. I guess the challenge has become, so by being able to standardize the test position, it's arguably a lot easier to do as long as you've got the right set of IWF calibrated discs to the right dimensions and you have a set of force plates. It's relatively easy to do. All of the other tests require a little bit more hands-on setup. So for things like getting the hip and knee angles right, in the mid-thigh pull, the same thing for the transition position. That's probably a harder test, if I'm honest, to try and get people in the right position, because intuitively people want to be a little bit further behind the bar at that point in order to be able to push through the platform. So standardizing that test was one of the challenges, and perhaps may explain why, if you look at this paper, particularly the reliability was a little bit lower compared with the mid-thigh and the start position. So yes, it's from a standardization perspective, as long as you have an eye on how the athlete actually forms the test itself, then you could argue it's better in that sense.
The next logical question would be, okay, it is the best test for cross-sectional prediction. So now today I want to know if I would have to predict in this lifter the performance. I'm testing isometric pull in start position and I can get this prediction. Now, how does it influence the longitudinal prediction? Would the positions change, or how should we go about this next step?
Yeah, so we've recently had a paper accepted in IJSPP, which is there to answer that exact question. So for this study, what we did, we wanted to know, right, from the 3 isometric pull positions that we've tested so far, we have some evidence to suggest cross-sectionally that is significantly stronger correlation than the mid-thigh pull. If you clue them all in the same model, that model only retains the start position without any added value added by the transition and mid-thigh pull position. However, does that actually hold up over time? Does that suggest that the isometric start position pull is a better longitudinal predictor? So does it have more temporal stability? Does it actually track with performance over time? So if something is a real predictor or a real determinant of performance, and this is where we're trying to answer some of the questions around causality, but again, being constrained by being able to do the types of studies you need to be able to answer that question with a high degree of confidence. Those types of designs are often impractical within applied environments. And so the next best thing is, if you've got longitudinal data, can we infer based on long-term trends and looking at associations over time, whether there is something more to be gleaned from whether certain metrics have a temporal association, temporal stability and association with performance measures. And that's essentially what the question we were trying to answer with this paper. So for this, we only included 7 weightlifters because that was the only cohort that we had enough long-term data on. So we compared with the previous studies, we've really had to narrow down to the few number of participants where we had that much data on. So in this study, this was just an all-female cohort, and this would have been with our more senior international level lifters. And the measures we took were the same. So the isometric start position, transition, and mid-thigh. We looked at comp total, and then both measures were scaled using allometric scaling as well. So we looked at both the absolute and allometric scaling. So in terms of the analysis for this, we used a linear mix model. The fixed effects were like the peak force variables. The random intercepts were the individual athletes. And again, without pretending to be a stats expert, the random intercepts there just to account for the differences in baseline between participants. And this can be some of the limitations with some of the more traditional statistical approaches. If you have quite a heterogeneous group, you have quite different starting points, which means your means and standard deviations have a bit more, your standard deviation is a bit more spread. So arguably requires larger magnitudes of change to be able to detect an effect. In this case, it accounts for those differences in individual start points and takes that into consideration within the analysis. And what this then allows us to do is then track within athlete change over time. The way in which we ran the analysis is we ran 3 separate linear mix models. Now, I think a valid point might be that why wouldn't you include all 3 within the same model? We felt like we'd kind of addressed the point of whether they all made a collective contribution to explaining performance in the previous study. And again, they each still had very high collinearity to one another. So what we need to try and do is, again, try and control for that. We ran statistical tests to determine their collinearity. And again, it exceeded that threshold to analyze them all as part of the same model. And because we were now trying to determine whether one was stronger than the other, not whether they all fed into one particular model, we decided to run the linear mix model separate. So just to complement the linear mix model, what we also did was just present the data graphically as percentage change from baseline, and the data are all kind of organized into 3-month blocks. So you can see when the paper's published, I'd encourage people to go and have a look, particularly at that, because I think it illustrates the findings quite nicely, is that you can see within most of the athletes the trajectory over time in terms of percentage change from baseline, and how similar the isometric start position pull is relative to change in performance over that time period. So they actually track each other in most athletes really closely and have similar direction and magnitude of changes over a similar time course, and that's partly kind of illustrating some of the findings that were then reported through the linear mix model. So the output of the linear mix model showed that between 31 to 45% of the variance is explained by the isometric start position pull alone. So that was the only longitudinal predictor. And what it showed was that for 10 Newton increase in isometric start position pull peak force, you'd see an approximate 1 kilogram increase in total. And that then shows like a degree of temporal stability over time. So as you see a change in start position pull peak force change, you can have some greater level of confidence that you might see a proportional change within total. Now, again, it lacks some of methodological control to make conclusions about causality, but in terms of a step up from just the traditional correlational based data, it's certainly in the right direction, and it just gives a little bit more information to make inferences around potential causality when it comes to this particular measure. Again, when you allometrically scale the data, however, you see a reduction in the level of prediction of the model, and I think it reduces down to about 20% or so. So again, body mass is a big factor, and retrospectively, that's something we could have added into the model to account for the differences between participants. But again, it's something that needs to be considered for sort of future research, is really getting a control of the body mass, because that seems, especially in this sort of correlational design, something that I think there's some good work that's been done in trying to account for that, especially in a strength sport. But I think when it comes to this type of research, it's something that needs to be much further explored. Whilst a lot of these models give you predictive equations that you can enter in your mid-thigh pull peak force or start position pull peak force, and it will give you an estimate of what your snatch, clean and jerk or total should be, that's always going to be inherently flawed, because the model's based on the sample that was input into that model, and you can't always presume that that's going to apply to other individuals. And there's a range of factors that haven't been considered there, such as technical expertise, anthropometry, age, body mass, male and female. Like, there's so many other factors at play. The reason why I kind of look at it from a different lens is just acknowledging that those qualities are determinants and predictors of performance, and there should be perhaps a focus in terms of sort of KPIs that you're trying to develop. So you might not necessarily have a specific number that you have to hit in order to be able to hit a total. That would be kind of where we'd like to get to. But just knowing that maximal force production at the start of the lift is an important determinant of performance means that there should be sufficient emphasis on developing that quality. So there's two ways in which you can look at this. One, yes, it gives us some helpful predictive tools that we can use, but perhaps take with a pinch of salt. But what it's doing in the meantime is it's highlighting what are perhaps the most important qualities that need to be developed consistently across most athletes. It seems that these qualities that have emerged through this research shows perhaps where there needs to be greater emphasis on your maximal strength capabilities at the start of the lift, and perhaps greater emphasis on your speed qualities towards the back end of the pull. So I think just taking the predictive models with a pinch of salt when it comes to applying them, but knowing that they're giving some really interesting insights around what are some of the KPIs in terms of neuromuscular qualities that influence performance.
Right. I think the bottom line is that if you are measuring isometric pull in the starting position and it is rising, the peak force in this position, in this test, is rising consistently over time, but for different reasons, the athlete at the competition may not hit the total first time or second time, but if the numbers in this test are going consistently up, it is safe to assume that they are still improving, even though they were not able to execute their required total or the total we predicted at the competition. They are improving, and they are improving their capabilities from the
Yeah,
generation.
I see it as I see it as increasing potential. That's there's other factors at play. So you're raising your ceiling of how much force you can produce, and we know that that force in that particular position is relevant and it's important for performance. But there's not a guarantee that if you increase your force production by X number of newtons, you're going to see a translation to X number of kilograms on the bar. You've just raised your potential to do that, but there are other factors at play that we have to take into consideration. So, but that being said, I do think like maximal strength is kind of an overarching governing quality that underpins like your ballistic, powerful, rapid force production qualities as well, which obviously are equally important. But I think the way in which some of these maximal strength measures perhaps should be looked at, whilst we can't entirely put a specific value on what number you should hit, unless that value is increasing, it's probably unreasonable to suspect that your performance is going to increase, unless you've got a big strength reserve already. And this is perhaps where maybe using these predictive formulas can be maybe at least a start. And this is probably how I've used them within some of the athletes that I coach, is we'll use some of the formulas. But we tend to start from the top down. So what are your performance targets? What total do you want to hit? What snatch and clean and jerk do you want to hit? And then, right, what numbers do you need to be able to hit that total? And then, right, that if that says you need this amount isometric mid-thigh pull peak force, we might go to the middle of that plus the upper limit of that confidence interval. And we say, right, well, then we should be pretty confident that if you can produce this much force, then you have the required strength characteristics to hit that. If you already have those qualities, brilliant, then we can focus our attention on other things. But I tend to work from the top down rather than bottom up. So rather than just thinking, well, what are your scores and how can we use that to predict what attempts we might make in competition, I tend to look at it through a different lens, as like, what target total do we have? And then just work backwards from there.
Right. Excellent. I have two short questions I finish every interview with. So the first one is, which one is your favorite lift?
Clean and jerk. I was never really good at snatch.
That's your strength.
I wouldn't call it a strength. It was the less weaker of the two.
Oh, come on. And the last question is, where can people find you if they want to keep up with your research and maybe ask a question? Where should they go?
Yeah, I'm not particularly active on social media these days, even though I do have a Twitter and an Instagram. Like if I publish some work, I might post something. But if anyone wants to reach out, it's easier to perhaps get me on my university email address, which is shaun.joffe@stmary's.ac.uk.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shaun. A pleasure.
Thanks very much, Alex.